Begin by removing the weather cap hold-down screw using a ratchet drive and half-inch socket. With the hold-down screw removed, proceed to remove the weather cap itself from the hydrant. Next, remove the now visible thrust nut with the Clow Medallion thrust nut wrench and small sledgehammer. Open right hydrants will require a standard hex wrench to remove the small set screw between the thrust nut and the bonnet. Begin by placing the thrust nut wrench on top of the thrust nut and tapping the thrust nut wrench with the small hammer to loosen the threads in a clockwise direction. Once the thrust nut is off, inspect it and set it aside. Next, remove the operating nut using the adjustable wrench to turn toward open, threading the operating nut off the top of the stem. Once this is done, remove and set aside the two friction washers or thrust bearings located on the operating nut and possibly on top of the bonnet. With the upper stem threads exposed and the lubrication reservoir visible, inspect for grease level and standing water in the reservoir, which could indicate a failing main seat or missing or damaged O-rings in the reservoir. Next, proceed to remove the hydrant bonnet, removing the 4 hex head bolts and nuts using a drive ratchet and 15/16" socket. For bonnet stop hydrants only, insert the jam nut removal tool over the upper stem and lower into the bonnet until the socket engages the hex jam nut. Remove the nut by turning counterclockwise for open left hydrants or clockwise for open right. Omit this step if the stop is in the shoe. Once the hardware is off, grasp the bonnet and lift it slowly from the nozzle section and upper stem, then set it aside. Next, remove the nozzle section. You'll need a ratchet drive and 15/16" socket for a 5 1/4 medallion or a 3/4 inch socket for a 4 1/2 medallion to complete the task. Begin by removing the 8 bolts and nuts at the bottom of the nozzle section. As you remove the hardware, the 2 halves of the breakaway flange holding the nozzle section to the barrel will also drop off. Set the item's bolts and nuts aside for later use in reassembly. With the hardware removed, lift the nozzle section from the hydrant assembly, grasping it at the top just under the hose nozzle outlets and lifting so that it clears the upper stem. This will expose the barrel and stem assembly and have you ready to install the hydrant extension. Locate the OEM hydrant extension and begin by removing the bolts and nuts holding the wooden plates to the extension body. Set these aside as you will need them later in the assembly. Once these are removed, locate the instructions, extension stem, extension coupling, and O-rings inside the extension package. Using needle nose pliers, remove the lower safety coupling pin by removing first the cotter pin and then pulling the safety coupling pin from the safety coupling. With the pin removed, you will now be able to lift the upper stem from the assembly, setting it aside. Moving on, locate the extension coupling and install it onto the lower stem with the arrow facing upward. Proceed to install the coupling and cotter pins before installing the extension stem onto the extension coupling using the same process. Once secure, install the upper stem to the extension stem. Lower the extension barrel over the stems on top of the hydrant main barrel. Make sure the O-ring is in place and using the bolts, nuts, and flanges removed from the extension kit, secure the extension barrel to the hydrant barrel. Lift the nozzle section back into place. And reinstall the breakaway flanges and hardware removed earlier. Again, tighten bolts and nuts to 75 foot-pounds of torque. Also, ensure that the two O-rings in the lubrication reservoir as well as the bonnet O-ring on the nozzle section are in place and undamaged before moving on. Lower the bonnet over the stem sleeve until it comes to rest on the nozzle. Finally, you're in position to reinstall the hardware on top of the bonnet. Align the bonnet bolt holes with the nozzle bolt holes, loosely installing the hex bolts and nuts you removed earlier. Be sure to replace the thrust bearings removed at disassembly correctly on the upper and lower side of the operating nut. On bonnet stop hydrants, reinstall the hex jam nut on the upper stem. Grease the upper portion of the bonnet and stem threads and install the operating nut on the upper stem. Hand tighten the operating nut and install the thrust nut, lowering it until it engages the threads of the bonnet. Use the thrust nut wrench to tighten the thrust nut counterclockwise and use the small hammer to tap it into place. On open right hydrants, reinstall the hex set screw removed at disassembly. Install the weather cap and cap bolt and tighten. Finish by tightening the nuts and bolts on the upper part of the hydrant. Installation of the Medallion hydrant extension is now complete.